I speak to you in the name of the living God, blessed Trinity, and lover of your souls. Amen. Sophia in Greek, chokmah in Hebrew, sapiensi in Latin. This is the word we know in English as wisdom. Today's reading from 1 Kings describes the rise of King Solomon, and if you've heard anything about him, I bet it's that he was the wisest person who ever lived. Today, we get the origin story of this wisdom superpower. Shortly after Solomon ascends the throne, God gives the new king a dream that invites him to ask God for anything. Solomon names one thing, and surprisingly, it's not wisdom. At least it's not Sophia or chokmah or sapiensi. What Solomon asks for is a heart that can hear. That's what's written in the Hebrew. Give to your servant a heart that can hear. Now, there are dozens of superheroes that can read minds, but I have yet to find one, other than Solomon, who can read hearts. What do you think he means when he asks for a heart that can hear? For you and for me, we understand the heart is the seat of our emotions, right? But in King Solomon's time, the heart was the location of the entire inner self. Now, even though science around today's body function has shown us that it's the brain that processes emotion, this idea that the heart does that work is still around, and I bet it's right here in this congregation. According to a 2013 psychological study, 48% of Americans identify the heart as the location of their very selves. Subjects were asked whether they located their sense of self in their head or their heart. The study found that irrespective of sex differences, head locators, they characterize themselves as rational, logical, and a bit interpersonally cold. Whereas heart locators characterize themselves as emotional, as feminine, and as interpersonally warm. Head locators were more accurate in answering general knowledge questions and had higher GPAs. But heart locators were more likely to favor emotion and to favor it over rational considerations in moral decision-making. Ultimately, where the person pointed to as the source of their soul, that was where their sense of self resides. It's the place they lived their lives from, the place from which they made all their decisions and found their identity. And when God asked Solomon what he wanted for his kingship, he pointed to his heart. In the ancient world, the brain was considered to be a storage unit of some kind of matter, but the heart, this was the home of perception and the place where emotions were balanced in the body. God gave Solomon the intellectual clarity, the emotional balance he sought, and everyone who met him called that wisdom. So now it's time for our poll. How many of you see yourself as a head person? Raise your hand. Come on now, don't be shy. Heart person? Confused person? There we go. See, that's my group. I'm one of the confused ones. I have a hard time with this question about the location of my inner self. I think I may naturally lean a little bit toward the head. And yet, when my heart is open, I'm aware that I begin to access a different kind of knowing. A part of me even feels closer to the divine and everybody else. Something I learned during my time as a hospital chaplain helps me. Some of you may have heard me use this before. The medical researchers I worked with taught me that emotion is data. Emotions are points of inquiry that, like our senses, give us information about where we should be directing our attention. Emotions point out places where we need awareness. The acceptance of emotion as data can help some of us head people bring awareness a bit lower into the body, into the heart, where we can allow feelings to play a role in decision making. But contrary to popular song lyrics and Hallmark movies, listen to your heart isn't actually about letting your emotions simply rule you or make all of the decisions. It's not what it's about. When Solomon asked for a heart that could hear, he was seeking a greater ability to know himself internally, so much so that he could align his whole self with the will of God. See, when Solomon asked for a heart that could hear, that hearing bit was a request to access something deeper than knowledge or emotion. It was spiritual obedience that he sought. In Hebrew, the word for hear that he used is shema, which means to hear with the ears and to listen with the heart and to obey with your actions. I think what Solomon and modern psychology are both showing us is that listening to your heart isn't about being led by emotion. It's about leading from this place of access to your soul, the place within you where God dwells. The French call this place the soul kiss. I love that. The ancient Sufis described it as the residence of God. One French Islamic scholar called it la Pointe Vierge, the place within us untainted by our attachments and our desires. The hearing heart isn't a place within us where we suddenly become mindless automatons and just do whatever God desires. It's the place where all that we are and all who God is comes together to discern right action. When we listen with our heads alone, we can get stuck in our own thoughts, and everything from biases to traumas arise, all the emotional baggage we carry, that just gets in the way. Head thinking sees emotion as inconsequential. But when we listen with our hearts, we can recognize emotion as data, and our minds can use it to find clarity. Our hidden emotions can rise to our awareness, and we gain self-understanding. We gain what Solomon gained, wisdom. Slam poet Andrea Gibson is a social activist and political commentator who was diagnosed with cancer a few years ago. I was really sad to hear this. I used to listen to her poetry in college. I loved it. The older stuff that she did focused primarily on LGBTQ issues. But since her diagnoses, I've found that her newer stuff has this remarkable ability to crack open la Pointe Vierge in me. Do you know that sometimes when gathering nectar, bees fall asleep in flowers? She writes. Do you know fish are so sensitive? Snowflakes sound like fireworks when they land on the water. Do you know whales will follow their injured friends to shore, often taking their own lives, so as to not let their loved ones be alone when they die? Do you know sea otters hold hands when they sleep so they won't drift apart? Do you know squirrels plant thousands of trees every year just from forgetting where they left their acorns? None of this is poetry, she writes. It's just the earth being who she is. Andrea Gibson's poetry has this remarkable capacity to connect the listener to all of creation because I think she has met wisdom. The earth just being who she is a pretty decent definition of ancient understanding of wisdom, who is personified as a woman and described as the feminine divine. The church fathers and mothers saw wisdom as the personification of God's creation of the whole world. The Gospel of John calls her Logos and sees her in Christ. The Jewish rabbis equate wisdom with Torah, the law of God's love. In Syriac Christianity, the Spirit was depicted as a mothering bird of the universe hovering over the waters of creation in Genesis 1. Proverbs 3:19 tells us that God created all that is by and through wisdom. When Andrea Gibson writes about bees and sea otters and maybe even those squirrels, do you see yourself in their actions as I do? Holding the hand of your beloved at night so you don't drift apart. Do you see God's law of love in every creature, great and small, the whale who would lay down his life for his friend? Wisdom is our mother. She connects us to each other, teaches us to hear and obey God's will within. She helps us realize that we are not lone individuals lost in an endless abyss, but rather one of many of God's children, reliant on each other, connected to one another. Last week, Andrea Gibson shared a story on Instagram about struggling with her emotions. As a poet, she says, her emotions usually move through her rather quickly. She welcomes them, she processes them, she recycles them back into the world. But the effects of her cancer treatments had brought her to a place where for weeks, the emotional processing that came so naturally to her just wasn't happening. And last week, she found herself gardening in the backyard. She reached to pick a ripe tomato, but on its backside was a wasp that stung her on the wrist. And at first, Gibson was angry. Her hand really hurt. And that wasp sting became just one more tally on her list of painful experiences for the day. But about an hour later, she realized that all that unprocessed emotion she'd been carrying, she could now name as grief, and it was gone. It was gone. Surprised and pleasantly confused that the weight she had carried had miraculously disappeared, she remembered the wasp. And she visited an acupuncturist the next day to ask about the location of that wasp sting. Is this, she asked the acupuncturist, an acupuncture site? It is, the acupuncturist said. We call that the heart protector point. We prick you there, and that needle will open your heart. Give to your servant a heart that can hear. That was Solomon's request. And if you listen to Gibson's story with your head, you might think, well, that wasp sting was due to the wasp's survival instinct. And that may be true. But if you listen with your heart, you hear that sometimes wasps are acupuncturists, pressing their practiced needles into supple skin to heal grieving hearts with a soul kiss. When we listen with our heads, emotion gets in the way. But when we listen with our hearts, emotion becomes data, and we find wisdom within us at the very center of who God made us to be. To get wisdom is to love oneself. That's also from the biblical book of Proverbs, which, by the way, is one of the biblical books of wisdom traditionally attributed to King Solomon. When Solomon was a young king, he asked God to give him a heart that could hear so that he could govern God's people. But as an old king, it seems, he realized that the gift of a hearing heart wasn't just for other people. It was for himself, too. Developing a heart that hears taught Solomon how to love himself. A few weeks ago, I was in conversation with some Trinity members about a story in the Gospel of Mark that I alluded to earlier. I called it God's Law of Love. A Torah scribe comes to Jesus and asks him, in all of Torah and all that Mother Wisdom has to offer us, which of her commandments is the most important? Love God and love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus tells them, right? But we often spend so much time focusing on the loving God and loving neighbor parts that we neglect the part of this commandment that requires us to love ourselves. What we learn from Solomon's request for a hearing heart is that all along God made these 3 commandments connected. I can almost hear King Solomon whisper, if you seek to love God and love your neighbor as I did, then first ask God to give you a heart that can hear. First, seek to love yourself, because once you get wisdom, loving all her creatures as God loves them will come as naturally as a mother loving the ones she's birthed. You are not exempt from God's law of love. The first person God chooses to give love to isn't the neighbor, it's you. You get to take care of the rest. God is that wasp who uses all creation to sting you right about here, just when you need it most. A sting that might come to you in a dream, as it did to Solomon, or a wasp, as it did to Andrea Gibson. And it might be painful at first, but give the sting an hour or so, and you just might find that it helped your heart hear a little clearer, that all along it was a soul kiss from the divine.